What's in a phone call? Well, it rather depends. On Wednesday this week, for the first time ever as far as I'm aware, but more importantly the first time since Russia invaded a year and 2 months ago, Chinese President Xi Jinping held a telephone call with Ukraine's President Zelensky. The most important part of their discussion is, let's face it, not in the public domain, at least not in any detail. And what does get made public has to be seen very carefully in context and with a certain amount of reading between the lines, bearing in mind that that can be a precarious activity if you do it too imaginatively. So what was the context that made this such an important moment? Well, up until now, China has made vague rhetorical noises about its neutrality, but very much alongside expressions of support for Russia in general, even if being careful not to defend the actual invasion. While avoiding all discussion with Zelensky to date, there have been at least 5 calls between President Xi and Vladimir Putin and 2 in-person meetings, most recently just a month ago in a full state visit to Moscow. It's fair to say that Putin was likely disappointed with how few concrete things came out of that visit, but even so, China and Russia see themselves as partners in spirit against the old unipolar world order framed around the interests of the United States. The actions being taken against Putin's Russia today are actions that President Xi knows could be brought to bear against China tomorrow. So even if he disapproves of Putin's adventurism, and public indicators seem to indicate that he does to some extent, the value of a relationship and being at the head of a coalition remains strategically important enough that it won't be given up lightly. So what role can China really play as a peacemaker in this particular conflict? It's tricky, but the most significant thing right now is that it is projecting itself into the situation. That in itself is an indicator that China now sees its place in the world as becoming completely transformed from where it was just a decade ago. We'll come back to that in a moment. What about the call itself? Well, Zelensky has publicly praised it as long and meaningful. The Chinese government's published write-up of the call was, shall we say, somewhat nuanced. China-Ukraine relations, after 31 years of development, have reached a level of strategic partnership, it said, boosting development and revitalization of the two countries. The two sides need to look to the future, view and handle the bilateral relations from a long-term perspective, carry forward the tradition of mutual respect and sincerity, and take the China-Ukraine strategic partnership forward. You wouldn't naturally assume, if you didn't already know, that paragraph was referring to a country currently caught in an existential war. There was one phrase that President Xi is supposed to have used to Zelensky that actually echoes quite strikingly something that he has also said to Russia. Almost, but with a significant difference. So to Zelensky he said, no matter how the international situation evolves, China is willing to work with Ukraine to advance mutually beneficial cooperation. The version he said instead to Putin was, no matter how the international situation evolves, China will continue to exert efforts to advance the China-Russia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership of Coordination for a new era. The similarities are obviously intentional, presumably intended to underline China's studied neutrality. But there's a difference between saying that China is willing to cooperate with Ukraine versus saying that China will cooperate with Russia. Chinese officials, after all, have often stated they are willing to improve relations with the United States. Such statements play a certain part in the public discourse. They don't come with concrete proposals to achieve such an outcome. It's part of saying that the other side has to change to move in our direction. This reflects what we already know. China has pled its cause as a neutral agent, but then when it does so, it usually attacks the NATO countries quite vigorously while passing comment on others hardly at all. And Putin's view is that Ukraine is effectively a puppet state for NATO. So while China might not wholly agree with that assessment, the current dynamic is very much that it's drawing heavily from its partnership with the West. So China's room for manoeuvre is limited, and its positioning has to be somewhat delicate. It forges common currency with Ukraine by noting that mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity is the political foundation of China-Ukraine relations. It's the key important principle because in invading his neighbour, Putin laid down a fundamental challenge to this world order based on that sort of national sovereignty. But here's the thing about such rhetoric. History shows the concepts are malleable enough to be applied with a degree of licence, at least in the minds of the powerful. So in the week when this telephone call was made, a Chinese envoy, Ambassador Liu She, caused a huge backlash in Europe by questioning the sovereignty of the post-Soviet states. This is the game. Of course we believe in national sovereignty and territorial integrity, but if you go far back enough in history, you will find an arrangement that might suit you better than the present day. And you can always use that history as your validation as to why the status quo can be attacked in the name of territorial integrity. There is no nation state I can think of that hasn't been formed via a history of various tribes and nationalities invading, then being pushed back, boundaries changing in the meantime. After all, I speak from a nation that was formed from the invasion of Germanic tribes and periodically Nordic ones, and then of course the French. That was all a very long time ago. But then most of Europe has had more malleable boundaries to much more recent times. Should all of that be challenged and undone? Germany pushed back to the time before Bismarck, perhaps? Now, of course, the Chinese ambassador was making no such general point. He was instead echoing Moscow's perspective so far as it deeply regrets the end of the Soviet Union, which of course largely fell apart as its constituent nations demanded freedom from it. But then Putin is well known for his view that true sovereignty attaches only to the great powers, and minor nations, non-sovereign under his definition, should accept that they have to align themselves or otherwise adapt or else fall to the great powers. If the ambassador's words were to be taken as signalling that Beijing was formally aligning itself with Putin's view in that regard, that would certainly merit the unease that they provoked. There's no evidence so far that that was the case, that this was anything other than someone speaking out of turn. Some commentators suggested that President Xi's call with President Zelensky was precipitated by the ambassador's outburst, that it was part of desperate damage control on the part of the Chinese. Personally, I think that unlikely. I think it somewhat underestimates what I believe of China's growing confidence in its ability to project its power abroad. It actively resists any idea that events should push it into doing something it otherwise would not have done. Plus, it's too strategically important to China to be seen to be taking a measured, considered, but above all proactive role in this conflict for it to make any part of it up as it goes along. China is starting to embrace the idea that a world superpower, such as what it wants to be, plays such a role, something that it always used to shy away from. Hence its higher profile role peacemaking in the Middle East, and hence its determination to be seen as neutral with Ukraine and to take action to become seen as a player of significance in the conflict. And it's a reflection of that power that Ukraine, which understands only too well how important Beijing's influence with Putin may turn out to be, must necessarily bend to accommodate China's intended role. Ukraine, of course, yes, is allied with the West. The West has been providing weapons. But the West has little leverage on the final outcome, so Ukraine, in looking for how it can survive, is open to whatever options are ahead of it. Hence, President Zelensky contextualised his call with Xi Jinping in his nightly address to his own people as an opportunity to use China's political influence to restore the strength of the principles and rules on which peace should be based. But it's worth noting as well the third paragraph of Kiev's readout from the call, which, quote, reaffirmed Ukraine's unwavering position on adherence to the One China policy. The One China policy being, of course, the historical understanding that Taiwan is part of China. For the purposes of discussions around territorial integrity, remember, this seems rather important. That China can push Ukraine, a country focused on its own integrity, to side with it in its ambitions in relation to Taiwan is a real indicator of the long game Beijing is playing here. So what practically short-term came out of the call? China has said that it will send a special envoy to actively engage with both parties, a small step towards trying to act as a mediator in a conflict that everyone knows is not yet ready for mediation. This envoy will be Li Hui, a veteran former ambassador to Russia, who will presumably be a little bit more careful about what he says in public. It's a low-risk, relatively low-impact move for now. If we're looking at China as a skilled player of the long game, essentially it seems to be positioning itself as being a power broker in whatever happens once the war ends. One might presume that China sees itself as able, and the leverage I've just discussed is part of that, to prevent the post-war Ukraine from totally embracing the West in its recovery process. Indeed, China's ability to prevent such a pivot may well become the crucial bargaining factor that would give Moscow its face-saving formula at the end, some way off though that may seem. In its fondest wishes, it might also provide the substance for the wedge that Beijing hopes to drive between the EU and the United States. Certainly, recent visits from Germany's Olaf Scholz and France's Emmanuel Macron might well lead it to believe that this is in the bounds of the politically possible. Indeed, even the UK, one of the most hawk-like to date, saw in the last few days its Foreign Secretary making a major speech focusing purely on relations with China and arguing that given all the mutual interest that Britain and the West have with the Chinese, it is not realistic simply to withdraw from them completely. So it is that former adversaries gradually work their way into coming to terms with the reality of a power that they suddenly realise is too big to be lightly ignored or indeed defied. In the meantime, things will go on as they have before. Neither Ukraine nor Russia will enhance their leverage in any resultant negotiations by being less robust right now in pursuit of their stated goals. So accordingly, Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov told the press that Russia was, quote, prepared to welcome everything that could bring the end of the conflict in Ukraine closer, while crucially adding that Russia was still intent on achieving all of the goals that have been set. Zelensky likewise continues to insist that the only solution acceptable to Ukraine is restoration of its pre-2014 borders. And this is what we would expect. Nothing will change on that front until something of substance has changed in the balance of power. That could be on the battlefield or otherwise in the shifting of geopolitical allegiances and realities. Either way, what seems evident right now is that China will be seeking its own advantage in the endgame once it arrives. Whether you see that fact as the opening that could lead to an end to the war, or as another dangerous aspect of what could be lost, that very much depends on your perspective. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.